Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of the virtual Treasury exchange. I want to welcome everybody to day 2 of this event. We already had a great first day led by Francois yesterday, which we spent a lot of time around making Treasury more efficient, making Treasury more effective, and also aligning Treasury more to the strategy of the company, and also bringing us closer to innovation, further enhancing the role of Treasury within the company, and at the same time also making Treasury more important within the group. So first, I'll introduce myself. My name is Tim de Knecht, and I head the Strategic Finance and Treasury team at the Port of Rotterdam, which you can see in my background. Today we have a wonderful day planned for you again, kind of reiterating what we spent time on yesterday, and going further into the different topics. And we'll start off with a business continuity panel, building a resilient Treasury strategy to survive and thrive after a crisis. After that, we'll have a fireside chat around refocusing risk management processes to adapt to current market changes. Then we'll kind of dive into the one-on-one business meetings, continuing after this with the virtual roundtables around banking relationships and around women in Treasury. And we'll finish off today with a plenary presentation around a successful launch of an inaugural Swiss franc bond during the pandemic. And last but not least, I want to make sure that everybody learns about the fact that we also do a giveaway today for the £100 Amazon voucher at the end of the session today, and hopefully one of you will win this voucher. But without further ado, I want to give the focus to Kevin, who is the CEO and co-founder of Treasury Spring, for this first panel session around business continuity.
Hey Tim, thanks very much for that introduction. So hi, I'm Kevin Cook. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Treasury Spring, which is a London-based financial technology company operating in the cash management space. I'm delighted to be here today to lead this brilliant panel on business continuity, building a resilient Treasury strategy to survive and thrive after a crisis. Joined by some excellent panelists. I've got Felix Luber, Britta Bayer, Marcus Kere, and Christian Mioso. I wonder if each of you could please help me and the audience by introducing yourself quickly, and also maybe giving a little bit of information on your crisis credentials, I guess. What have you experienced in terms of crises through your career? And then maybe I'll wrap up and give a little bit of my perspective on that as well. So perhaps if we could start with Felix.
Yes, sure. Thanks for the invitation. Hi, I'm Felix Luber. I'm the head of Treasury and Payments at Marley Spoon. I'm here currently having the great opportunity at Marley Spoon to build the Treasury department from the scratch and build as well the payment department. For those who do not know, Marley Spoon is an online meal kit delivery service. So you have a weekly subscription for your dinner plates. My crisis DNA, maybe a short summary about that, about my personal crisis during my professional career. So this is during my 8th year of Treasury experience. I think it's the 5th employer, because I was laid off 3 times. So first started with was in a bank, and they were in run-off mode, so they couldn't give me a permanent contract, and I had to search for a new job. After that, I went to Zalando, helping them to build the cash management over there. Then I went to Germania, which was an airline in Germany, as the head of Treasury. And during my watch as head of Treasury, we filed for insolvency. So this was kind of a big crisis. And afterwards, I went to Rocket Internet, which is a VC based in Berlin. And due to a big restructuring, they had to lay off lots of their employees. So once again, I was on the search for a new job, under kind of a pressure. And now I'm here at Marley Spoon, and I hope for a bit of a longer time.
Thanks, Felix. Yes, I guess it's interesting. You've got company crises and then broader crises. What's Christian? If you could just introduce yourself and maybe give a little bit of your experience too.
Sure, thanks, Kevin. Hello and good morning, good afternoon to everybody. My name is Christian Yosio. I'm currently responsible for group treasury and M&A activities in Electrolux Professional. Electrolux Professional is the business-to-business side of Electrolux. It's a fully independent company. We listed right in the middle of the pandemic on the Nasdaq Stock Exchange back in March 2020. And in 2019, when we separated,
I think we might be losing Christian's internet. I can't hear him. The rest of the panelists, can you not hear him either? Just check it's not me.
Really, I didn't have
you're back.
such. Can you hear me, guys?
We can now. Carry on, Christian.
Okay, good.
Lost you momentarily.
Okay, good. So crisis experience, really two major experience. One was I was covering as a temporary CFO position, small, medium enterprises, which was changing business model, mostly related to, let's say, balance between sourcing and investments of funds. Second period or second experience, very much this year, hospitality, or last year, hospitality was hit the hardest ever in the last 20 years. So we had to manage two very different situations, but all in all, I would say one common theme, Kevin, understanding the business also for treasurers, it seems to be quite key in order to set up and arrange the various countermeasures to be able to sail through the crisis in the best possible way.
Thanks, Christian. Yeah, I mean, look forward to hearing a little bit more around what it was like being in hospitality through March, April of last year. It was, yeah, I guess something that no one would have predicted in a sector that felt like it was kind of on the up and up, and then suddenly to have that thrown at you and closure for, I guess, what was the best part of a year must have been pretty difficult to manage from a treasury perspective. But more on that later. So, Marcus, over to you, please.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you also to Treasury Exchange for having me back. It's a delight to be here, although unfortunately I won't be meeting you all in person. But my name is Marcus Kede, and I'm heading our Group Treasury and Insurance Department here in Lundbeck, where I've been for about 7 years, and also having two different teams within our group finance setting, so finance process team and admin controlling team as well. So I have a little bit of a broader perspective on it. From an experience perspective, I actually started my career. So my first job after school was back in beginning of 2009, where I was actually employed due to the financial crisis, as the company were quite hard hit and needed to expand the treasury organization. So kind of diving directly into a little bit of the fire and firefighting after the quite big hit of the financial crisis back then. And then I think the current, where we're, I guess, still in the end of, you could say, the crisis with the COVID. From our perspective in Lundbeck, even though the company has not been significantly hit compared to many other companies, we were actually out doing a funding round. So we're about to do our first bond issuance in the beginning of 2020. Based on our acquisitions we did in 2019, and we're actually on roadshow in the spurs of the pandemic, and had some of the meetings being moved from physical to virtual, and actually coming back home after roadshow to a more or less closed capital markets. So we had to do a pause on our bond issuance and redo it in the fall of last year. So some of the learnings of ensuring that you actually have funding in place, because you never know what will happen when you're out doing the longer term bond funding or whatever it could be.
I imagine you were glad that you had some fallback options in place when you realized that what was going on in capital markets last February, March time.
For sure, for sure.
Yeah. Great, well, and that's really helpful. So maybe if we can move on and talk about learnings from those crises that you talked about and explore that a little further. Britta, last but not least, over to you.
Yeah, welcome also from my part. My name is Britta. I work for Apleona Group beginning of June, so it's quite new. My current company is doing quite okay. However, my previous jobs have been with Takata and Alba Group. And here there were various crises, let's say, mainly based on operational issues. So starting with any breach in the financial contracts, we had to organize waiver consultants with the banks. And let's say CFOs who are getting more and more nervous, having consultants coming into the company and having a pace which is going quicker and quicker and quicker. And that's mainly my experience regarding any crisis within Treasury.
Thanks, Britta. Yeah, so maybe I'll just give a little bit of background on my crisis experience and talk a bit about what I learned from it. And then maybe if anybody else wants to sort of pick up from there and add their own experiences. So for me, I started my career right at the back end of the dot-com bust. So one of my first jobs ever was working through, as a junior lawyer, some of the claim documentation for the Enron bankruptcy, which some of you are probably old enough to remember, some maybe not so much. But I didn't really understand kind of what had gone before then. And then I had a lovely period where the world felt like it was in a good place. And I remember distinctly Gordon Brown and his famous, for those of you in the UK, we've seen the end of boom and bust, and it's going to be perfect. Beautiful financial success going forward. And then, of course, 2008 happened, and at that time my business partners and I were sat in a maturity transformed fixed income hedge fund, and we'd had all these beautiful models about how all of our underlying exposures were uncorrelated, and we'd done all of our work on the fact that all of our counterparties were of a high credit quality. And suddenly overnight what we found was that things that looked like they were really uncorrelated became very correlated very quickly. We realized that lots of things that we thought were really liquid suddenly turned out to have no bid or price in the market, similar to what you were saying, Marcus. Capital markets literally kind of shut overnight. And we also found that all of these things that we thought were of a high credit quality were suddenly struggling for credit all at the same time. And so from a personal perspective, those events left kind of indelible marks on my brain and the way that we've run all of our businesses ever since. So lessons of really not underestimating those risks of liquidity, of correlation, of really making sure that you have a proper handle on credit, and of making sure that you've got the ability to diversify, because again, sort of to your point, Marcus, if you've only got one option and it goes away, then you find yourself in a little bit of a tricky situation. Whereas if you can spread that risk, whether that be on the investing side or on the funding side, then it might sometimes feel like kind of over engineering or preparing a little too much, and maybe we'll talk a bit more about that later. But in my mind, one of the things I've learned is that you always have to prepare for those events that are going to be unlikely, and you have to try and convince people that even if for years they wonder as to why you went through this effort and put this stuff in place, it's the times that you least expect it that people are grateful for the fact that perhaps you were a little more conservative and a little more pessimistic and a little more protecting the downside than always looking for whatever the next efficiency or gain that you can make might be. Who shall I pick on? Maybe Christian, do you want to expand on kind of anything I've said that resonates with you and or your own learnings from your times through those crises that you mentioned?
Thank you, Kevin. I think what you said is really the key, in the sense that preparation is absolutely fundamental. But as you said correctly, you can prepare up to a point, because every crisis has different dynamics. It is clear. It's very important to understand what sort of company you're working for, what are the characteristics of the business, or the underlying business, because understanding the characteristic of the underlying business helps you support the dynamics around cash requirements, investment requirements, sourcing types, And I've seen sometimes it is not necessarily, it doesn't come naturally to have a fair assessment of source of fundings and investment requirements, and understanding the true seasonality of the business, understanding the true dynamics of the working capital, etc. So you can prepare. Absolutely, you have to prepare, and prepare has different layers. Preparation goes through stuff up cash when you don't necessarily need it. Sometimes. Not a lot, but a little bit more than what is required, because money comes cheap when you don't need it, unfortunately. When you need it, they're never available. That requires also a lot of internal education and effort, as you say correctly. It's not always easy to convince the powers that be that you need certain things to protect the company in the long term. So you need to have a long-term vision. But as I said, you can prepare up to a point. After that, you really need to go into the crisis and manage the crisis. And I found in my experience that managing the crisis brings you back to basics, brings you back to what really counts. What is your customer, or is your customer going to be affected by the crisis? Is a crisis that is generated by you and the way you manage the finance, or is a crisis generated by the environment? As I was referring to earlier on, we found ourselves into an environment which was very hostile back in March last year. And all of a sudden, coming from years and years of, I would say, a healthy management of the company and, balance sheet and P&L results, etc., all of a sudden we found that the market around us was shut down. So we had to go down into the detail and see, okay, what is the part of the business that is still working? What is the part of the business that is suffering the most? How can we support the customers? Because shutting down means that customers are basically, most of the world is not functioning. And as a consequence, the intermediaries, i.e. the banks, they tend to protect themselves as well. So they tend to stop lending money to customers, to third parties, to people that use funding to buy equipment, in our case, for example. So we went back to basics and say, okay, what is the customer? What does the customer need? Can we support them through our strength?
Thanks, Christian. Maybe we come back to managing through a crisis in a little bit. But if I just pick up on something you said about preparing for a crisis and understanding the business, are there key things that either you did or didn't do in your earlier time, sort of leading up to last March, where you think, gosh, it's a really good idea that I understood this about the business before that happened, or we prepared for this in a certain way and that helped us as we entered the difficulties of last year?
Yeah, what I push a lot internally was to try and make everything available at the center, which means I wanted to have visibility on all the cash flow dynamics that were taking place in the business. We manage about 40 companies around the world. So we had to get a pretty solid infrastructure in place. I focused very much on getting pretty solid infrastructure in place, ability to understand which were the companies that were suffering a little bit more, which were the companies that were generating a little bit more results, profitability, and cash. And therefore, visibility and understanding. At the same time, I've always kept a very open dialogue with the banking partners to explain the business over and beyond the technicalities of finance, to explain to them that how the business was functioning in the various verticals we have. And I think that helped a lot. First, because it gave me sort of, I wouldn't call it peace of mind, but it gave me a reasonable amount of comfort in understanding where I could, stop funding and where I could get funding internally. At the same time, I always had the support from the banking community, who appreciated a lot the fact that we were very open in talking about the good things as well as the bad things.
Yeah, it's really interesting that. So it's not just internal visibility and internal education, but it's also understanding your banks and making sure that they in turn understand you, so that you know that if you go to them with a particular request or at a particular time, they already have enough understanding of the business to perhaps be able to process that in a way that they might not if they were a customer where they're perhaps a little more arm's length. Britta, any sort of similar learnings or alternative ideas from you?
Yes, exactly. I think I have nothing material to add. So it was very informative already what he was talking about. However, I think that we could emphasize that the team structure is really, really important, because if you only have a team structure where the people are doing, let's say, the task like payments or ordering guarantees, those people won't be very flexible, maybe cannot be very flexible if it comes to crisis management. And then I think very quickly you have an issue, because either the head of treasury has to work for 3, or you have to raise your hand quite early towards your boss, the CFO, in order to get some more resources, because otherwise you won't be able to somehow proceed.
Yeah, so it's, I guess you need to, it's different depending on where you sit in the organization, I guess. Maybe if you're a group treasurer or senior treasury person, then it's kind of on you to try and understand the business and to make sure that you get your head around holistically what's going on in the department and broader. But I guess if you're more junior, perhaps, you know, maybe you need to look out for those junior people and make sure that they're getting that level of understanding, that they're getting the right exposure. As you say, that people don't become siloed into, I just go to work every day and I do this same thing and I don't really understand how that fits into the rest of the business. Marcus, I guess you've been at Lundbeck, as you mentioned, for a while and kind of gone through that journey. You know, how have the structures in place or the way that the firm's organized itself helped you to get to a point that you have a good holistic understanding? Are there any recommendations that you'd have for people? And then finally, beyond that, kind of any other learnings that you've got from in terms of preparing for crises?
Yeah, thank you. I think leveraging a little bit on what both Christian and Britta said as well, I actually were that junior person, the extra resource being pulled in there back in 2008. And the reason for that, and one of the key learnings, were that the company did not have, or the treasury department did not have, the fundamentals in place. And I think there's a few elements as a treasury, head of treasury, that you need to be on top of at all times, being liquidity, being funding of the company, being your credit risks, both towards customers, but also towards your banks. And in that particular case, we were not on top of our liquidity, as an example. So when the liquidity drained, and we didn't have the insights of how much money did we have, how much money would we have the next couple of weeks, and would we be able to pay our salaries, and would we be able to pay our vendors and so on, required a significant effort in getting that in control at the same time as it was kind of in a burning stage. So I think that's is something that I brought with me. And also to Christian's point, where you can be an additional support to the company is when you have your fundamentals in place. And that's, I think, where one of my learnings, and what we have in Lundbeck going into the crisis here with COVID, we had a lot of things in place, which meant that we could quite quickly do more value-adding activities, such as doing stress testing of liquidity, helping the finance organization more broadly, ensuring that we could close our books in time, assessing potential different scenarios together with our FP&A team of, if we were impacted so and so, how would that impact the business? Is there cost controls that we need to put in place, and so on? So you basically, when you have the fundamentals in place, then you can really be an additional support. I think that goes a little bit back to what Christian is saying, having that view on what is the customer's needs. If you're not in control of how much liquidity I have, then you have 0% of your capacity looking at those other aspects of the business. And then I think leveraging a little bit on what I said previously on us going out in the bond market in March 2020, we actually had a quite solid funding in place going into that. So it would basically be replacing long-term bank funding with cheaper, hopefully cheaper funding in the capital markets. And that was actually leading, or going into the acquisitions we made in 2019. It was a strategic discussion with the board of what type of funding we should put in place, where some of the people in the board also had significant crisis experience from other companies, where they basically told us a bridge funding for a year, it's not going to happen, because we've been there. We've been in situations before where we need to raise capital in a situation where it's for one reason or another really, really tough, and we don't want to be in a company where that happens again. And actually myself were a little bit skeptical. Okay, we put something a little bit more expensive in place for a scenario, and we did a lot of analysis back in 2008. How long were the capital market actually closed? Is it really worth it, the additional security or investment to have this? And then we actually end up in exactly that situation, and we were so thankful for the board really pushing us to have that long-term funding in place, never being in a situation when you are in reliance on anyone else, always being able to be sufficiently funded at all times. I think is very key learning as well.
Yeah, so I guess if you'd been sort of always trying to find the last penny or being as aggressive as you could, going for the capital markets funding or the bridge financing would have felt like the right option. But having that baseline there, even if it might have felt like it wasn't the optimal solution, was what protected you in the end. And, you know, at some point in the future, you'll have the ability to go out and raise cheaper financing or go to the capital markets and then replace that potentially. But yeah, that preparedness and that making sure that you've got redundancy and resilience is key. Felix, I guess maybe you've been in some companies that maybe haven't been as prepared as they perhaps could have been, judging by the stories that you told us at the beginning. Are there lessons that you learned from those companies where you think, gosh, I'm really going to make sure that I don't do that here at Marley Spoon, or indeed positives that you've taken with you?
Yeah, well, I would say, I mean, one thing is always to have kind of experience management. With the treasury department, you cannot save the company. So I always say, okay, I as a treasurer, I'm the guy that is somehow swinging the bell and telling people, look, we have a major issue here. But then it comes to an operational thing. So I think this is one thing maybe that, and one thing that I took with me over my business crisis over the last years: life goes on. So don't get too stressed about the situation, because I mean, in the end of the day, companies come and go, as to my personal experience, but life goes on, and my personal life goes on, and there will, especially in treasury, there will always be a new position. So what I personally took with me is not to get too much stressed from these situations. Regarding the business, so I think what I really learned from the Germania example, so the airline, is it helps a lot if there are some people invested into the company, because the situation of the Germania was that the CEO owned the company almost fully. So therefore, there was not an investor in the background or a bank in the background or whatever that would face a dramatic loss if the company filed for insolvency. And this is a situation I would like to try to avoid in the future, so that no one else is losing something if you file for insolvency, because then no one will help you, of course. I mean, you would never put cash into a company you're not invested into just to help them. It's not going to happen. So therefore, I think this is a thing somehow comparable to Marcus, what he explained. So like bringing the financing early into the company is really important, and maybe it's not that important to get the last cent out of it. Maybe it's more important to see it as a risk measure to have a long-term financing there and long-term investments into your company.
Yeah, it comes back to that point of diversification, doesn't it? Whether it be debt financing options or equity shareholders, ultimately, the more diversification you've got, the more...
I don't know if diversification is so great, because if everyone loses just a tiny bit, they will let you fall. Maybe it's better to have at least one person that really suffers from your crisis.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. You want people to be incentivized.
Yes,
still,
yes.
Not just to have a, I'm just along with this one for the ride and we'll see where it ends up.
Yeah.
People to have enough to be incentivized, but not so much that there's nobody else to help.
Yes. And maybe a bit to touching Britta's point with the employees. the team. What I did at Germania was to clean up the team early, because it was kind of obvious from a treasury perspective that this company will have an issue. And therefore I somehow checked who's capable of going through a crisis and who not. And I would always recommend to help your people, to be capable of a crisis, and to be prepared with a crisis. And if they are not capable of managing a crisis, then I would look out to find another solution for that person. Best case internally in the company, maybe another position that will not face the big stress when it comes to the crisis. Or if this is not a solution at all, well, have a discussion with that person if this is really the job this person should do, and find another solution. But I would always recommend to check the team if they are capable of what is coming to them, because otherwise this will be a huge stress for them, and maybe they will break from that. And on the other hand, you cannot have someone on board that is not able to manage the situation if it comes to a crisis, in my experience.
Yeah, it's a good point, Felix. Not everybody is set up for those sorts of circumstances, and for everybody.
Yeah, not everyone wants to have this. I mean, in this situation with Germania, it was, I mean, maybe you've heard of Air Berlin. This was an airline as well, sitting in the same building like Germania. And
Lars Windhorst was involved, if I remember correctly.
What?
Lars Windhorst was involved with the financing of Air Berlin, if I remember correctly.
Okay, yeah, and lots of people were coming from Air Berlin to Germania. And so they faced already this crisis before. And then it's only fair to tell them, look, we might have a crisis here as well. Do you really want to do this? So now's the time to just tell me, I don't want to do this. It's too much for me, and I will support you in finding a new job. It's fine. But make up your mind before we drive into this.
Britta, you look like the sort of lady who thrives on a crisis. What have you learned from managing through a crisis scenario, as opposed to just preparing for it? You know, and what lessons have you got to take away in terms of what you would perhaps do the same again, and maybe do differently in terms of dealing with a crisis day to day and coming out the other side of it?
Yeah. Well, in addition to the team issue, which I already mentioned, I really agree with Felix's comments as well. Let's say the wording, keep calm and carry on. That's also what I learned for myself, because in the end, I cannot save the company, neither my team can. And therefore, maybe as another add-on, I think communication is also very key. So if you inform your CFO that there is a problem and that the problem might become material in 1 week or 1 month, it's okay. But if on a Monday morning you go to the CFO and inform him, look, now we have a problem, I think it's not okay. And therefore, to be prepared and to always have everything in mind and to communicate as good as possible. This was also one of my key learnings. And then maybe as a last one, I think it's also important for Treasury to know that also other departments are completely stressed out in such times, for example, purchasing, because the supplier cannot be paid, and therefore the purchasing guys are receiving calls from any suppliers day per day asking for their cash. So there's also a lot of pressure on them. And of course, they want to somehow channel the pressure on another person, and why not to channel it into Treasury? And therefore, yes, keep calm and carry on, try to be as neutral as possible. And yes, for me, it was helpful to also understand the situation where my colleagues are in.
So clear, open communication, and having a little bit of empathy for the fact that maybe Treasury isn't the only department that might be suffering at this point in time. Christian, I guess
maybe can I quickly?
Of course, Felix. Yeah, sure.
Because when it comes to this purchasing thing, I mean, we had a lot of this in the airline, and I would always recommend to have a really collaborational approach here. So during that time, we sat together every day. So when it came to the end, we sat together every day, and we were just managing expectations, and we were openly discussing which can we delay, which can we not delay, what would be the consequence of not paying this. And so it wasn't a thing like finger pointing or putting the pressure on someone. It was just a collaborate approach. And we all said, okay, this we can do, this we can't do. For this one, the treasurer needs to make a call and to make an explanation. For that one, the treasurer maybe drafts an explanation like, we have problems with our invoice processes, whatever you do during these times. Yeah. So, but I would always recommend to speak openly with the other departments and say, okay, look, we are fucked up, and now we need to find a solution together. And don't ever try, and if someone else is doing that, open the discussion about not doing that and doing it collaboratively. Try always to work as a team there, because in the end of the day, it's not about who made the mistake here or whatever. You cannot, I mean, COVID, no one made the mistake of COVID or other crises in the companies. It's not a single person. So therefore, I would always say, sit together and find a solution for that, and see yourself as kind of a family, and you want to protect your family. So which is the company.
So collaboration and communication. Marcus, yes. From your perspective, things to add in your experience at Lundbeck?
And I just have a little bit of an anecdote on the same, because in my previous company, we're very much in the same situation where we had to prioritize which suppliers to pay in principle. And together with both the CFO and CEO, we actually took the decision to delay all payments with 2 weeks. And then we're kind of having the approach, let's see what happens. And the ones who scream, okay, then we need to attend to those. And there might be a lot who is not screaming, and then we will be kind of successful. And the company was located in Sweden, and both the CEO and CFO were lived in Denmark. So we're crossing the bridge every day. And one of the payments were to the bridge company. So one morning they were quite a bit delayed because the payments to the bridge company was delayed and they could not pass. They were directly impacted by the decision of delaying payments. So I think that's also a learning that it's easy to take decisions where you are not faced directly with the consequence, but when you get very close to it, then it's you feel the impact, so to say. So
yeah, so empathy for customers and understanding the knock-on effects as well, I guess.
Exactly.
Christian, with people in, I think you mentioned 40 different countries. You must have had some interesting experiences trying to communicate and collaborate through this crisis.
Sorry guys, my connection just stopped for a few seconds. I don't know, Kevin, whether the question was towards me.
Oh, it was, Christian. Yeah, I was just saying, you mentioned earlier you had people in sort of 40 countries and money moving in 40 countries. That must have made communication and collaboration a little harder than perhaps if you were a nice centralized business with everybody in the same place.
No, that's absolutely the case. We kind of go back to what we were saying before, in the sense that, you know, communication is key, but also it depends on how you want to structure your function, your treasury function, and your funding model, so to speak. For example, in our case, we fund the center, then the center supports, let's call it the children, the subsidiaries, right? So the subsidiaries get funded from the center, and only in extreme cases where the center cannot fund the subsidiaries, they need to set up their own structure or their own local funding. And that might be mostly related to red tape issues, you know, regulations and things that you don't easily overcome, especially when you move money from one place to the other. I would like to raise one point though, which is kind of tied to what the other guys were saying, and which is very relevant. It's not only communication. I would say it's attitude, and I like to use a word which is business partner. I don't know whether, you know, the model is the treasury of the future or was the treasury of the past, but treasury is a function that tends to get wider and wider if you consider, but besides cash management, pure cash management infrastructure. But if you look in many instances, you have corporate finance activities within treasury, you have market operations activities. So You have a balance between technical aspects and less technical aspects, and these require a lot of education, internal education. So I'll give you the example, and I think we are living this on a daily basis. We come from a group, so we were a division of a group. As a division of a group, treasury tends to be managed at group level. Cash is never an issue. The division needs cash. They go to the group and they ask for cash. Now, when we separated out, well, cash was a new dimension. We were all measured on profitability, on P&L. But all of a sudden, we have other components that are making the cake. So other ingredients, you have financial dimensions, you have balance sheet, you have, funding that was never considered. And therefore, you need to work a lot internally in a sort of continuous improvement mentality. It's not just a matter of, I've got a crisis, I need to push payment back by 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I need to work all around the year to decide what my cash conversion cycle is going to be a year from now. I will need to work, commercially speaking, on the contract side, but there are plenty of instruments if you think about supply chain, factory, reverse factory, inventory management, financing, that the treasurer can embrace and to support the business. So it's really not last minute. It's more a continuous plan to try and stay ahead of the game, try and understand also where the market on the capitals is moving. And I think this is the key.
Yeah, and so I think that difference, that balance between being prepared for a crisis or managing through a crisis, both are really important. But I think it sounds like everybody agrees that unless you prepare properly, then managing is going to be pretty difficult. So it's critical to continuously be thinking about making sure that you've got everything in place, that diversification, that resilience, that communication, collaboration, in order to mean that when the next crisis does hit, you can be in a much better place for it. But I guess to some extent, this is fixing the roof while the sun's shining. It's saying logical things, which are, let's go and make sure that we're prepared when it happens. How's that internally, though? Because I know in lots of businesses, trying to get budget for people for things that maybe don't seem, it's that distinction between important and urgent. And things that are often important but don't seem urgent are the ones that people ignore, the ones that are hardest to get funding for. Has anyone got any advice as to the best way to get internal stakeholders to really buy into the fact that we need to build this resilient treasury? And do you think that now, in the aftermath of the previous crisis, is a really good time to go and try and have those conversations while it's still fresh in people's memories that things do go wrong? Because as humans, we have a tendency to sort of gloss over that and forget it over time, in my experience. Britta, do you want to go?
Yeah, well, big question. I think during crisis times, of course, it's much easier to get any budget for whatever. If you're not in a crisis, I think it can be very difficult. And then maybe, it needs to be distinguished. If you already work for the company since 10 years, then maybe it will be more difficult to ask for any additional budget. Otherwise, if you're new to a company, sometimes it's good if there was also a personal cut in order for ask things. But in the end, I think the, let's say, backup must be prepared very, very well, so that the CFO can see the value added. For example, how many costs can he save in the long run? Or can he save any HR times here, any colleagues who are not needed anymore? So yes, I think it's a tricky question, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, in our experience, budget's never overflowing in treasury, but it's, from my mind, it's easy for me to say sitting on the sidelines, but always there seems to be a lot of focus on efficiency and on cost cutting, and that's a way to get budget. I'm going to need less people, I'm going to be able to automate this process, whatever. Whereas perhaps a slightly more long-term approach of I'm going to prevent us from losing X, Y, and Z, or I'm going to enable us to make sure that we don't have this enormous stress next time things go wrong is a pretty good reason for getting some budget. I don't know, anyone else got any experiences of how best to manage that? Felix, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, maybe my situation is a little bit different because I was usually in companies where the treasury was just being built or in the phase of building, or now at Marley Spoon, I'm hired to build a treasury department. So in my experience, it was kind of easy to receive a budget for a tool or something like this, because we had the decision that we want to build a treasury function. And with building a treasury function, it's clear for everyone that you need as well some tools. I mean, you cannot do the treasury in Excel. If you would say we can do everything in Excel, well, maybe you would save as well the cost for the head of treasury, to be fair. So therefore, I mean, usually when I was asking for a budget, and it was the first thing when I came to Marley Spoon, I told the people, look, I need a budget. So this was almost day one when I was there. I told them, thanks for hiring me. Now I need cash. But I think if you give your CFO the vision, what you would like to do. So I would always start with that. I would always say, okay, this is what I want to have in my treasury department. This is our status, but I would like to be able to do this kind of reporting, and I want to do like this, and I want to consolidate my banking activities in a tool, so trade TMS or whatever, and to somehow start with the vision. And if the CFO or whoever needs to approve the budget agrees to the vision, then I think it's a no-brainer to say, well, and this is the tool to somehow execute this plan, because it's then clear for everyone. We have this vision. We want to have this kind of tooling, etc. And then it's just a matter of, okay, what kind of tool do we need? So maybe you do not always need the best tool in place. Maybe it can be a cheaper one, because you don't need to have in-house banking functionalities as well. Maybe this you do not need right now. So maybe you can go with another tool. But if you start with convincing someone that you need to have functionality, then I think it's more easy to have as well the tool itself. So I would always recommend not to start with the tool. I would recommend to start with the vision.
No, it makes a lot of sense to start with a business case, make sure you get the buy-in for that, and then tell people.
Yeah, and maybe
it's going to cost a little bit of money.
Yeah, maybe not even starting with the P&L of that project.
Yeah,
I would not recommend that, because then everyone is directly focused on the costs.
Yeah.
And if the first thing you receive is a bill, well, you say, well, no. But if the first thing you receive is kind of the idea where the treasury department should develop to, and you just top level align on what you want to do, what treasury is for you, and to understand if this is the same for the CFO, and you have a common ground, then you're talking about how to implement that common ground, and you're not talking about costs in the first place, because CFOs never want to see costs. In my experience, they want to see why we are doing something. They want to develop all the tools. They want to develop the processes. They want to set up a cool processes in finance. And if you go there and explain why this is a cool process, then it's an easy next step to discuss about how to implement that.
Just Christian, just going back to you, just obviously when you separated out and it became an independent company, were there, in your experience, was it selling that vision? Was it getting everybody on the same page as to what the vision is, and then understanding what you needed in order to deliver on that?
That was exactly the case, and even more so if you consider that there was not really full understanding of the treasury activities, or what is the treasury. There was a lot of association of, oh, the treasury is the department that manages cash. That's it. Well, in reality, it's a bit more complex than that. And especially when we started to build up the capital structure of the independent company. So looking at the sourcing. And so we started by saying, okay, what do we need? Where do we want to go? What is it that we need as a basic functionalities for the treasury to be a support or a proactive sort of department that help the business grow. And we started from there. So I would say that we're still in the middle of it. Huh? Don't get me wrong. 18 months or whatever it is, 16 months from listing, we're still working on the cultural change of understanding why do we do certain things, why we're looking at certain products, or why we need certain infrastructure to be able to concentrate even further what we're doing. So to be honest, in my experience, but I must say, I don't come from a crisis situation. I come from a company that has always been cash generative and has always been managed pretty consistently. So I've never received a sort of hard nose on the desire to develop. Although I must say, I've been always focusing on trying and maximize infrastructure, digitalization, connectivity, everything that could be done through a system and it could support the business in simplifying the life of certain part of the business through, ID brokers or through everything that could automatize certain processes. I've been investing in those. And that's, the benefit of it is that probably you don't have to grow the headcount as much. The downside is sometimes, is not everything hunky-dory as it sounds when you digitalize. Sometimes, you still need to deal with the fact that the banking world sometimes requires wet ink of a specific color when you sign a document. So you need to deal with reality. I mean, today's reality. I mean, maybe 10 years from now, it would be different.
Yeah, I mean, actually, so that leads us into one of the questions that we got from the audience. Hopefully we're moving a little bit away from having to have things signed in ink from a quill, although I know certainly it happens in some places. We've got a question from someone in the audience saying, when we talk about preparing for fundamentals, does the panel see digitization as a fundamental consideration that treasurers must now take? What technology would the panel consider their most fundamental when dealing with a crisis for the past year? So, I guess I've definitely heard cash visibility from people as a critical thing. Others, well, maybe first, do you think that digitization is critical in order to preparing the fundamentals? And secondly, if it is, which bits of that digital chain do you think are the most important? Marcus?
Yeah, maybe I can give it a shot. I definitely think it's the investment to make, right? And same as Christian is saying, doing it in the right place where you can see the benefit and the value add from the digital tool, and also leveraging it a little bit back to your previous question around fixing the roof when the sun is shining. I think we really have that opportunity now in hindsight of the crisis to look over what are there any fundamental changes we want to make, because now is probably the time where you have an increased chance of getting that additional investment, but looking at it on a longer term, not a quick fix for something that is needed to fix the crisis that just happened, but something that you need to enable the fundamentals of your treasury departments for the long run and to make it more stable or holistic into the next crisis. But digitalization is definitely an enabler that makes you take the next step, take the next leap in order to be more efficient, in order to, I think from a fraud perspective, it's a huge enabler to protect, because you can simply not go through all your payments or validate everything that's happening on your accounts. So you need that assistance from digitalization to support you and your business in many different elements. It's also connectivity with your banks and so on. And all of that enables you to be more secure when things happen.
Yeah, so it sounds like kind of anything that's going to make your department more resilient through digitization, anything that's going to give greater transparency, greater optionality, greater redundancy are all useful things for people to be investing in.
Yeah, and it might of course be different depending on your situation. I think that's the important part, to assess where are you in your company, what is valuable to you, and having that same as Felix is saying, having that strategy and vision. Where do I want to take my treasury department, and what tools and systems, because there are 1,000 things out there that you can apply. So it's having what is actually fitting in my situation that will enable me to take my treasury department to the next step.
Yeah, so I guess you need that vision, that plan that Felix talked about, and then you kind of map that plan against what's out there, and then you can work out where to invest. We've just got a couple of minutes left. I've got one specific question for Christian, if you can try and answer it in 30 seconds, because I've got one more for the panel. So it says, during the crisis, did you change your cash management strategy? Many countries tried to assist their local private sector with cash help or reducing the lending rate. Did you, for example, borrow money in one country to support other countries' subsidiaries, except from head office?
No, I didn't change cash management approach. Where I found that, for example, it was not difficult, but it required too much time to support specific countries, I open up lines with same banking partners locally to support the bank in case of, I'm talking about, I give you an example, we use a lot of banking guarantees, operational guarantees when we do project business. So we have a large projects and therefore we need, customer required for guarantees to be in place. So I tried to support the business where needed, started from the business, but I didn't really change, change approach. I always act as a reference port of call, whether through pools or whether through internal loans. But I was more, of course, careful about the local dynamics. Certain countries, as you can imagine, think of the pandemic as an evolution. Asia started first, and then it moved westward. So Asia suffered first, but then recovered first, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, makes sense. So with just a minute left, just to thank everybody for your time. Really interesting discussion. I know I could definitely happily carry on talking about this for a long time, but unfortunately I suspect people want to go and have their sandwiches. But just as you leave, any parting comments that any of you want to make, but also just for a bit of fun, when do you think the next crisis will happen? Pick a year, and if you want to give a reason as to what you think will cause it, throw it out there. If not, don't worry about it. Christian, just because you're spotlighted on my speaker, I'll go to you first.
Within 3 to 5 years. That's all I can say.
Yeah.
A lot of frequency.
Britta, any different view?
No clue, frankly speaking. Can happen tomorrow, can happen in 10 years. Let's see.
Marcus?
I will be the optimist then and say in 15 years. So we'll have a smooth sailing for a long period of time now.
Okay, and Felix?
I mean, coming from the airline sector, we had a crisis every year, so next year will be the next year with a crisis.
Well, I'm a fixed income guy at heart, so for me, I am fairly bearish as well. So I reckon we might get to the start of Christian's window of 3 to 5 years, but I'm not convinced we're going to get that much beyond that. But like I say, I'm always the pessimist on this stuff. But there we go. Anyway, thanks so much to everybody for your time. Really interesting discussion, and I will hand back to Tim to take things from here.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Christian, Felix, Britta, and Marcus for your very interesting session. I want to introduce George and Martin on stage now for our next session. George Dessing, who is the Executive Vice President Executive Vice President Treasury and Risk for Wolters Kluwer, and Maarten Micheledis, who is the Head of Treasury for Annexis. Obviously, you can introduce yourself in a few seconds, and we'll have a chat about how to refocus your risk management processes to adapt to the current market changes. Maybe Maarten, I can give you the word first, since you're already unmuted.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Hi, good day. Now, my name is Maarten Mccarrick. I'm the treasurer of Annexis. It's a Dutch grid operator. We manage approximately 1/3 of the Dutch regional electricity and gas grids. And just to give you an impression of the size, our balance sheet is roughly 8 billion, and our debt position is roughly 3 billion. And I have management responsibility for a team of 6. And next to the typical treasury activities, we're also responsible for the energy purchases to make up for the grid losses, which are approximately 60 million euros per annum. And I'm now 2 years with the company, and previously I worked at various treasury departments in the Netherlands, including Heineken, ASML, and Vion. And I look forward to sharing some recent experiences with you.
Thank you, and maybe go over to George then.
Hey Tim, hi everybody. My name is George Zessing and I work for Woltz Kluwer, which is a global leader in professional services, software solutions, and these kind of things, delivering on professionals, doctors, tax and accountants, bankers even. So a nice bridge to what we speak about today. Our total revenue is 4.6 billion. We have customers in over 180 countries. We have main units in 40 countries. Myself, I'm working at the head office in Alphen aan den Rijn in the Netherlands. Same as Martin, my responsibility is global treasury, but also risk management, which is including insurance and incident management, which Tim, hopefully, we will speak later on with. And then finally, I'm also responsible for real estate. Luckily, I'm not doing this on my own with a group of over 35 people, and I'm with the company more than 20 years. So back to you, Tim.
Great. Well, thank you for the introductions, and as I mentioned earlier, we'll speak about kind of what adjustments we have made to our financial risk management policies and how that has been impacted by the crises. So maybe first off, Marta, how did your financial risk management strategies kind of adapted this last year? What changes have you made?
Taking a step back, looking first at what the grid operator actually does. Well, important to note is that we have a monopoly. We are regulated in our service area. Our tariffs are set by the regulator and are capacity based. So, because we provide a vital service, we distribute gas and electricity. COVID actually had very little impact. Of course, we shifted some investments. We're mainly focused on the energy transition, and our main concern was, after we concluded that the impact of COVID was limited, that we could continue our work on enabling the energy transition. Of course, at the outset, we did form special teams to monitor impact of vendors on customers, but we soon concluded that no special support was needed. As a treasurer, I could give comfort to my colleagues that liquidity wasn't a big issue. So again, we could continue to focus on our core business. As part of this core business, we also the increasing level of investments. We also have to raise a lot of capital. We were in the middle of raising additional capital with our shareholders, which are 5 provinces and 88 municipalities. So when the crisis struck, we were negotiating with them and structuring this special structure. And of course, we're very glad that we managed to issue the first tranche in June last year, despite all this COVID around us.
So when you say that, and obviously, as you mentioned there, you were not kind of heavily affected by COVID. How did this? Because obviously, some of your shareholders were affected in more or less, if not anything, and in a political way. How did this affect kind of that process last year?
Yeah, that's a good question, because at that level, politicians were wondering, well, we have to give a lot of support to society, and also for support programs directly related to COVID. What's the priority now for the energy transition? I guess relevant were 2 things. It's just very much at the outset of COVID, so the impact was difficult to assess from their perspective. Other relevant thing is that 75% of our shares are owned by provinces. That also had sort of different COVID impact than municipalities. And lastly, the energy transition has is a program that will last the coming decades. So I think at that point, everyone was still sort of convinced that COVID would be a kind of temporary thing, which let's hope likely will be.
And when you say that, I think you've mentioned also in one of your previous comments about kind of the importance of ESG, the importance of changing kind of consumer expectations, dynamics, and also what you just mentioned around kind of the political landscape. How does that affect? Does that affect it, and does COVID also affect kind of future decision making and the risk kind of assumptions that are in that decision making?
Well, if you look at ESG, not particular, I mean, at the outset of COVID and also in the middle, we focused on work that's required as little as possible physical interaction, while also continue to focus on the investments, bringing some other work forward and delaying some other stuff. ESG is very important for us. We enable the energy transition, so I think we have to lead there by example. Last year also, we were a bit late though with the issuance of our first green bond, also in June, so it was pretty busy for us at first quarter of COVID. But as a distributor of electricity and gas, again, facilitating the transition, facilitating transportation of green energy, of course, we have very solid ESG ratings and likely will keep those ratings, solid ratings going forward. We didn't have to adjust our priorities there.
And if you obviously then your kind of financial risk management did not really change because of the pandemic, but obviously there's other topics that are kind of also interacting with that decision-making process, with this strategy. Do you see that kind of changing more regularly kind of going forward?
Well, what was relevant is that during the crisis, interest rates dropped, commodity prices dropped, and we are a regulated business. Our tariffs are set by the regulator based on levels a few years ago. So those low rates will have an effect in a few years, starting 2022. Our income, well, at least these low levels will have a negative effect on our income, and that will impact our financing capacity. Looking at our policies and internal strategy, my concern was to create awareness of this, more awareness of this internally, and also with regards to our discussions with the regulator about future remuneration. So
thank you, Marta, very well, and thank you for your elaboration. And maybe to you now, how did your kind of financial risk management strategy change during this crisis, and how do you see it changing more regularly, kind of going forward?
Yeah, sorry, Tim, to be the same consistent story that Martin is telling us already. Not a lot of change, I must say. Clearly, we've seen some changes, but actually the whole pandemic gave us, from a strategic point of view, only more strength that we're going into the right direction. Clearly, it diverted us a bit from a financial point of view with the organic growth. We see in the economy more uncertainty and volatility. Most likely, a lot of others have seen that one. Another point is that we have been facing is that there is a clear demand from our customer, the need for more technology, more tools. As you can imagine, we as a company are working in a space of cloud-based data management, these kind of things. So the whole mobility question is becoming more prominent. So these are dimensions that we see more often. So it's an underpinning of the current strategy that where we are at the moment. Yeah, and I must say, on a personal note, I experienced a lot. If you see my desk right now, it's a bit of a big mess because I'm transferring from one old laptop to another one. So that's a challenge for me. I learned myself that shops are open also during the day because that's what everybody's happening. So a lot of things are changing in our personal life, and we try to make sure that our teams keep on engaging and communicated. At the end of the day, maybe we as manager need to invest more time to stay much closer to our teams than maybe when we were in the office. But that's more my feeling at the moment.
Well, I think what you're mentioning, Edit, kind of the increased use of technologies, kind of staying closer to your team. I think those were also elements that were mentioned in the previous sessions as also kind of learnings from this last year. How have you kind of, as part of your business continuity processes, how have you included your team kind of and making them aware of what is supposed to be done, how you structure this? How have you included your team in that process, and how have you kept them up to date and included in that sense in the last year? Yeah,
well, it's a loaded question, Tim, to be honest, because I can answer that in multiple ways, but first of all, you know, the most important thing, and that is something that we always state within Wolters Kluwer, our people is our biggest asset, because we don't have a big grid like Martin is having, or a large infrastructure. So it's literally our data, our immaterial goods. So our people is the most important thing. So health and safety in this pandemic was the most important way. As I was also responsible for incident management, you can imagine that managing such a large crisis as the whole pandemic was a massive impact on my team. We had set up more than 200 teams globally, because we have over 200 locations. So that was a big change. But what I said earlier, we need to stay more closer than ever. So, you know, we shared a lot of successes with each other. Probably for myself, I had to become a little bit more patient. You know, that's another great learning from this pandemic. Take a step back, let it go, let the teams figure it out themselves. At the end of the day, we all experienced that we recruited some sensible people. So we also should give them a bit of room to maneuver. Speaking about room to maneuver, once in a while, take a break, stay energized, do something else, do something fun with your team. Although it's virtually, I know it is limited, but these small things, yeah, we try to optimize a little bit on what was heard earlier today with the communication and the engagement that we try to achieve among the teams.
Maybe, yeah, because I think one of the reasons why you guys were in such a kind of a prominent position and kind of positive position in that sense, was because you were able to kind of fix the roof when the sun was shining. I think that was the phrase used earlier as well. And so if you were able to do this last couple of years, so how did you kind of convince your internal stakeholders to do this? Was there any convincing needed in that sense?
Well, honestly, when it's all started, I think it's fair to say that everybody was a bit on their edge. It was a volatile, dynamic environment. People didn't really know how to react. There was no panic, I would say, but there was an extra sense of urgency. So we geared up our collection focus, more or less the same thing what's happening, what we heard on the earlier webinar. So that's also something that we did within Wolters Kluwer. But then we found out that our customers were there, and the need for our products was even further, because everybody was demanding for more mobility and these kind of things. And that's exactly what we deliver. I don't need to tell you the example for health and safety, but we do a quarter of our revenues in healthcare. So you can imagine that there's much more focus on that one. So I think we were there to support our customers in the most way that they're actually using it. And that brought us in the right space. We didn't sit on our hands, so we issued two new bonds in the last 12 to 18 months. We also did our credit facility. So liquidity is key, as always, as every treasury would say. And yeah, we tried to arrange that. And I think the market could see us coming through this crisis in a pretty positive way. And hence, there was no objection whatsoever for us.
How's that for you, Martin?
Yeah, I think I don't have really much to add to the answer that George gave. Sure, same story here.
No, I think if I kind of speak for myself and for my company in that sense, we also went through the crisis fairly smoothly, also from a financial perspective, and also what I kind of hear you guys say as well is that the focus, as you have your processes and structures in place, and you cleared up when the sun was shining, you were able to focus on these kind of more operational inefficiencies and more operational elements during that crisis, really making sure that the team was okay, that the interaction with the customers, with suppliers, and that all of these interactions were okay, and that you're able to kind of actually build upon your business rather than having to kind of focus on and go into panic mode in that sense to really kind of keep your company afloat. And I think one of the elements that I've seen this last year is, especially at the start of the crisis, I think it's kind of the need for nimbleness and the speed of decision making increases and is much more important, and also giving structure to the team, giving structure to the right people to make those right decisions. And I think George, I heard you say that as well. And maybe what do you guys play a role, and how do you kind of deal with that in your kind of role as managers for your teams? How do you kind of structure that kind of decision-making process amongst yourselves?
Well, I think what I noticed last sort of 12 months is that, well, comparing last 12 months to the period before, we were very accessible as treasury departments and colleagues just stepped to into your office and discussed all kinds of topics that they wanted to discuss, and there was always availability. Of course, when you're all working from home, that's more difficult. I sense also, and also to support my team, there's strong need to sort of formalize that communication, to put it more on paper, to make clear who is actually responsible for what. I supported my team by sort of taking the initiative and sort of making things clear and simpler, making the communication clear and simpler in the organization. That's really a change compared to when we were all still working in the office.
How's that for you, George?
Yeah, Tim. Well, clearly, what there is of course there is a great need for flexibility. That's something that we all feel. I'm more interested in what is actually ahead of us. So what will be the need of the future? You can imagine that I'm also responsible for real estate. That is something that makes at least my job pretty interesting, because things will change, that the office will change. Instead of a working space behind your workstations, the place for meet and engage, place for connect and create, all those nice buzz terms. So we are pretty busy with that. So how is the future work looking like that, where our employees, our team will be flexible, halfway maybe in the office, halfway maybe out. Clearly people which are more internationally already had that experience. But that is something that we are currently thinking of. We don't have the silver bullet yet. When people on the one hand are in a conference room physically together, there is a different interaction than people on Teams or maybe a combination. That is something that we're currently thinking about, how people go back, what's the amount of days that they work at home, what's the amount of days in the office. So a lot of big topics still need to be addressed, and we're going through that exercise right now, Tim.
Well, I think that kind of reiterates with what we're doing as well, and how we're looking at things in a similar manner. I think, and I think we've sort of stepped over that a little bit earlier, but I think all of us are saying that the world is kind of evolving more quickly every day, and is also becoming a lot more complicated and more connected in that sense every day. So even though we might not necessarily see a crisis soon kind of at this scale, I do think that we do see this connectedness making our kind of working life a bit more challenging and different in that sense. So I think and as things are kind of also speeding up in this connectedness as well, I think it'll make it even more challenging to making sure that we have the right information at the right time. I think the previous session we were kind of also learning about kind of having the right infrastructure in place to get that information. And I also heard Marta say earlier that obviously that there's a lot more integration with not necessarily just the financial infrastructure, but also with things like the energy infrastructure. Is that also something that kind of, because obviously that could also lead to a financial risk going forward? Is that also something that you're including in that sense, that kind of broader view in your decision-making process? Marta, is that something that you do, and like that besides finance?
Well, yeah, I said we're also responsible for compensating grid losses, so energy prices are relevant for Treasury. Yeah, I think the security and safety of our grid is really something that is organized in other departments. They don't really need a treasurer, fortunately, so for any help in that respect. My main focus is really to to make sure that we have sufficient financing capacity and that the financing capacity is not impacted too much by all kinds of risks. And that we also structure peripheral processes like ESG rating and all kinds of other processes as well as possible.
And so, because obviously those are interlinked, but also kind of separate at the same time. How do you make sure that those are kind of substantially kind of connected in that sense? Is there a way that you kind of how you deal with that, or is that just kind of does it organically come together?
Yeah, of course, it's our key responsibility is keeping the grid safe. That's the first one. Reducing outages to a minimum and facilitating the energy transition. That's our core business. As a treasury department, we facilitate that, we support that in any way we can. So I think treasury more has a supportive role.
How do you look at that, George?
Well, it's something that is of relevancy of us as well, of course. Managing an incident, as I said, I'm responsible for these kind of things. I'm not responsible for the whole security and the governance, like that Martin was saying. Luckily, I'm not, indeed, also to his point. But managing of the incident, yes, that falls on my plate, or at least my risk manager. So we are definitely also supportive on that front.
Well, I think, and maybe my role is a bit different from the traditional treasurer in that sense, because I'm also responsible for the investments that we do as a company. So I'm also responsible for that decision-making process. So one of the elements that I look at is integrating that kind of decision-making process, and not just taking financial decisions, but also including those other elements in that decision-making process. And one of the clear challenges that I see is kind of finding alignment within the group, in that sense, to make sure that everybody makes the decisions on the right kind of basis and with the right information, and kind of getting that information from the same or from similar kind of departments can be a bit of a challenge sometimes. So interesting to hear from you in that sense, how you do that, kind of how it kind of with you kind of flows more organically kind of together. As for me, it takes a bit more structuring in that sense, and policy driven.
I think the same goes for us. I mean, we need accurate information, timely information, and so on. So we put these kind of procedures more on paper than we did formally. That's the only way to sort of safeguard some kind of quality in our process as well. Again, for example, the ESG rating, where we just are passing through the information from other organizations, so their strategies, having a coordinating role. And there you indeed need to again take a more structured approach when you communicate with and to your colleagues.
No, and I can completely reiterate this, and I think one of the elements that we've seen in the last kind of 6 to 12 months is that kind of scenario planning was always important, but it kind of really understanding kind of what the drivers are behind scenarios, and understand kind of what drives what, and how do you underpin those decision-making points is obviously becoming much more relevant. But I think that we've kind of we dove a bit into kind of what you've done in this last kind of 6, 12, 18 months around this pandemic, and clearly we've seen a lot of alterations to our strategies, and not necessarily to our kind of financial risk management strategies. I think those have remained quite stably in place. But you've done quite a bit over this last year. Maybe kind of to reiterate that, or kind of to come back to that. So what have you done? What change have you made as a leader within your company that has really given kind of sight to this change? Marta, can you kind of maybe kind of focus on one element that you've done that really kind of made a difference in your perspective?
Yeah, I think a core competence of a treasurer is to simplify things. And I was always used to that on the sort of the treasury field, and like on finance, financial risk management, and so on. And I think while working from home and also seeing the impact of the crisis, what I also said earlier, sort of taking that same approach and to other processes. For example, lease decisions, the ESG rating, the grid losses, and all kinds of related technical topics, areas. I think, yeah, that was really helpful, both for us, but also for the organization. It gave us just more focus and made us more result oriented.
And so obviously that this is obviously a key competence for you and your team. How do you kind of continuously instill this competence within your team? Because obviously it's an ongoing kind of development of that competence to simplicity. How do you do that?
Just by focusing more on results, less on process. Again, where we come from is a sort of a stable utility. Now we are in a dynamic environment. We need to adapt. So change is part of the game, and the outcome can only be positive if you focus on results.
Tim, Martin, Tim, if I may speak to that as well. You know, I think I like your way, Martin, how you say simplify it, because it's also my mantra, if I may say so. So that's great. But if there is one thing that strikes us is this. You know, at the end of the day, it's the strength of your team that you currently have, and maybe we should think about certain other dimensions that we're looking for in people. You know, at the end of the day, we always were looking for critical thinkers, people with a certain, you know, streetwiseness. But now the need on more and more on networkers who are digital savvy, who can, in a mobile environment, more cope with all those challenges that we have. Although we like to simplify it, those other capabilities are becoming now more prominent. You know, we all have experienced that we can do things differently. You know, in the old days, we needed to have a roadshow when we issue a bond, and we needed to travel to 10 to 15 cities in Europe to sell some bonds. And nowadays we can do that all behind our screens. You know, things have been changing. So maybe we also should slowly think about the fact that we need different capabilities among our teams.
And if I may add to that, this experience I had the last sort of year. When I started 2 years ago, I was the youngest in the team. I was 49. So it was a bit of a mature team. Last year, 2 years, we introduced more dynamic by just introducing younger people, someone who just graduated from university, someone with few years experience, and already with a team of just 7. If you also change the teams and the composition of the sub-teams a bit, it gives some breathing space to some, allows some more ambition for others. I think that really sort of that contributes to your, that's in line with what you just said, George. So it's also the soft skills and the soft elements are very important next to what I just mentioned, the results.
And I think that it's really interesting to hear you say that, because I think that is something that has changed this last 5 years at least, and I think maybe even a shorter period within that 5 year frame. But that together with the point that you guys both make around kind of simplicity, I think that kind of obviously connectedness and more interactions makes things more difficult. And obviously kind of having that core competence around simplicity is a key element for all of us. And I think it's interesting also to hear from your perspective, how do you guys have, especially when adding these new team members, these younger team members who don't have that kind of that longer dated experience of kind of how things normally go. How do you kind of involve them? How do you kind of educate them and teach them how to balance that kind of that simplicity and that kind of those conflicts around kind of connectedness?
Yeah, I think actually the young team members, they sort of, through the questions, triggered the other team members to more simple answers, to focus on, well, what's actually the matter? How can I explain it in simple terms to the new guys? And so it goes sort of both ways. And indeed, the new team members didn't have any or had little experience and need to be introduced. There's also that again required the existing team and sort of explain what they're doing, what the key priorities are. So that whole process was quite supportive also of being more focused.
And did that have kind of any positive side effects over this last year, given the crisis, that having those team members in, having these qualities in, did it have any positive side effects this last year in that sense, that you kind of, maybe if you had a different team structure in place, would not have occurred?
Yeah, I think so. They seem more eager to sort of learn also from other departments how they're working, and sort of inviting people to as they said, to explain what they're doing, creating a more open atmosphere. So that is good. Whereas the existing team, well, already had their internal network, and I guess from that basis, it was more difficult to open new doors and create new insights.
Well, and I think maybe it might, obviously you have kind of that interaction on a Dutch level, because most of I think all of your colleagues are located here in the Netherlands. Maybe George, for you, because obviously you have a global business also with different geographies. Is it any different for you from your end in that sense?
Well, luckily not. I see Martin speaking with a smile and with some passion about his new talents that he obtained in his team. I think if you are in the Netherlands, or in my case, half of my team is in the States, that's still the same. Only we need to invest a little bit further in the connectiveness among each other. I must admit that normally I was every quarter at least a week in the States. That is something with a big question mark going forward. I haven't figured it out myself. Certainly feel that the live connection is still crucial also in our job. So I'm still feel that I will travel in the future, but maybe not as much as in the future. But at the end of the day, the biggest thing for a leader is if we can show their true intrinsic energy and commitment towards new talents. That's what they're looking for, and if you can indeed tell that with a smile and a bit of a passion that we all feel, I think then everything goes in the right direction, and then there's no difference in the US or here in the Netherlands.
Maybe as a final question to this session, and then we'll if there are any Q&As popping up, obviously more than helpful, more than happy to go through the Q&A as well. But so far we have not received any questions. But maybe to finalize things, I think you both have learned quite a bit over this last year, and also in previous crises, on how to go through this process. Is there any kind of other elements of the business that you are able to support with the learnings that you've gone through, with the learnings of the past, where you were able to kind of reuse some of that experience to help others within your business, and in that sense kind of show that leadership, not just within treasury, but also in other elements of the business?
Yeah, maybe Tim, if I may, the one thing that for us right now is how will the future look like? For us, I already alluded to that a bit. How will the role of the office will be, the remote working, how we can be effective, how we can make sure that people still can collaborate. That is something that for us is something that we still need to address and get to the right answer. So that is something that we learn every day, how to bring people back.
Marta, maybe it's Ellen from your side.
Yeah, I think the main priority for us is to get everyone more oriented on results, on outcomes, not just sort of do what they did and repeat what they were doing as a process, but together as in a cross-functional way, focus on the outcome, and also measuring that as sort of what's the impact on the company and specifically on our capacity to fund our new challenges, the energy transition. So that's really something that is key. It was always priority for Treasury, but I think creating it, sharing that awareness more broader, and also putting procedures and communication structures in place that sort of facilitate that's very important going forward.
Yeah, well, maybe to kind of share a bit on my end as well. We also in the previous session, it was mentioned how important it is to have the right infrastructure in place, especially around kind of cash forecasting and cash and liquidity management. I think one of the things that we've seen, and most of you are probably aware about what happened in the Suez Canal a couple of weeks back, with one of the larger container vessels getting stuck. I think what we've seen is that having that infrastructure in place, not necessarily just for your cash, but also for your other key processes. And for us, obviously, as a port, receiving ships in Rotterdam is a key process. So understanding when they've left a different location and when they're coming into Rotterdam is quite crucial, which is, as a process, fairly similar to when the cash leaves a customer and comes into you as their kind of end location. That obviously is one of the elements where we also kind of share our knowledge on how supply chains work, on how transactions work, and how we can provide this real interactive data. We knew kind of that ships were stuck in Suez before kind of a lot of the news came out. So obviously we were already preparing at that time for that incident management that George was also alluding to in his earlier conversation. So I think these are all elements where, and I think that the previous topic was also around this, and we have a lot of kind of knowledge around these processes that we can also kind of elaborate on and support other parts of the business to improve these processes as well. So I would also kind of urge you that as you are fixing the roof, kind of going forward, use that knowledge as well to not just fix your own roof, but also fix the other parts of the roof in your business to so that even though it might not rain through your roof, it also doesn't rain through the roof of your neighbor. Mm-hmm. That's a key element. Well, thank you very much, Maarten and George, for your contributions and for your very clear guidance on